The champagne was flowing, crystal glasses were clinking, and at the head of the table, my brother David was basking in the glow of his own ego. He looked at me sitting quietly in my 3-year-old dress and decided it was the perfect moment for a power play. The room went dead silent as he pointed a manicured finger at me and sneered, "I don't dine with anyone who's broke, Vanessa. Maybe you should take your plate to the kitchen." My sister-in-law covered a smirk. But I didn't shed a single tear. I just took a calm sip of water and smiled. Why, because David had forgotten the most important detail of his success. He thought his $2.1 billion empire was built on his genius. He didn't realize it was actually standing on my signature. That insult didn't just hurt my feelings, it triggered the deadliest legal trap in corporate history. He thought he was humiliating a poor relation. He didn't know he was mocking the only person standing between him and total financial ruin. By the time the sun rose the next morning, David wouldn't just be dining alone, he would be begging the broke sister to save him from prison. What follows is a masterclass in silent, brutal revenge. You are about to witness exactly how one quiet woman toppled a tyrant without raising her voice. Watch until the very end, because the twist in the final boardroom meeting is the most satisfying payback you will ever see. My name is Vanessa Sterling, and for 25 years I have been the silent architect behind one of the country's largest logistics empires. At 54, I am a certified forensic accountant and the company's original chief risk officer. Though, if you ask the guests at the table tonight, they would tell you I was simply David's dowdy unmarried older sister. I have spent a lifetime standing in the shadows, so my brother could shine in the sun, never realizing that the shadows are where the real power lives. But looking at the seating arrangement, you would never know I had birthed this beast. David sat at the head of the long mahogany table, flanked by investors and his new younger wife, basking in the golden glow of the chandeliers. While the rest of the table toasted with vintage Dom Perignon, raising crystal flutes high in the air to salute David's genius vision. I sipped tap water. I watched them through the distortion of the glassware. David was holding court, his voice booming as he described a future of automated drones and AI-driven supply chains. "It's a young man's game now." Jessica, David's wife, tittered, her voice carrying sharply over the din of silverware. She leaned forward, her eyes darting to me with a predatory gleam. "Vanessa dear, isn't that the same dress you wore to the 2015 shareholders meeting? It's so quaint. You certainly don't look like the owner of a billion-dollar entity. You look more like you're ready for Sunday bingo." It was a cruel, exclusionary sound. I didn't flinch. I didn't defend my choice of attire, nor did I mention that my quaint salary had bailed Jessica's father out of bankruptcy 2 years prior. To them, my silence looked like submission. They didn't understand that I was merely observing, gathering data like I always did. Then came the main event. David cleared his throat, tapping his spoon against his glass to silence the room. The spotlight was exactly where he wanted it. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick, heavy, cream-colored envelope. He didn't hand it to me. He slid it down the length of the table. It spun across the polished wood and came to a stop right next to my water glass. "Vanessa," David started, his voice dripping with a sickly, performative benevolence. "I've been thinking about you. You look tired. The market is shifting to a high-tech, aggressive model, and let's be honest, that's not your world. You're cautious. You're safe. But Sterling Industries can't afford safe anymore." He gestured to the envelope. "That is a severance package. A very generous one. It's time for you to rest, Nessie. Take the money. Go open that little bakery you used to talk about when we were kids. Or a flower shop. Something manageable. Something at your speed." The room went deadly quiet. He wasn't just firing me. He was erasing my professional identity. He was reducing the woman who built the tax structures and compliance frameworks of a multinational corporation to a baker of muffins. I placed my hand on the envelope. It felt heavy, loaded with legal jargon and zeros. I didn't open it. Instead, I looked up, meeting David's eyes for the first time that night. I kept my voice low, calm, and devoid of the hysteria he was hoping for. David, I said, my voice cutting through the silence. Before you do this, have you read the legacy surety clause in our original bank agreement from 2004? David threw his head back and laughed a loud, barking sound that signaled to everyone else that it was okay to mock me. Oh God, here she goes, he sneered, looking around the table for approval. Always the librarian, always obsessing over 20-year-old paperwork. This is exactly what I mean. You're drowning in small-minded anxiety, Vanessa. Nobody cares about the fine print anymore. We're visionaries. He thought he had won. He thought he had cut the dead weight loose. He didn't understand that power isn't about who shouts the loudest. It's about who holds the pen when the contracts are signed. He refused to listen, and in that moment of arrogance, he sealed his fate. He thought he was handing me a retirement gift. But as I touched the envelope, I realized he had just handed me the detonator to his own life. I walked out of the Pierre Hotel into the biting cold of the New York night, the heavy cream envelope tucked securely into my handbag. As the taxi navigated the gridlock of Fifth Avenue, my mind didn't dwell on the insults regarding my dress or the mockery of my bakery ambitions. Instead, it drifted back to a sweltering August weekend 3 years ago, a memory that David had conveniently excised from his version of history. He called it the quarter of expansion, but I remembered it as the 48 hours that almost buried us. David had been in the Maldives posting photos of turquoise water and white sand, celebrating a massive acquisition that he claimed would revolutionize our logistics chain. But back in the humid, empty office, the walls were closing in. A federal compliance audit had flagged a discrepancy in the acquisition funds, a sloppy error David had made in his haste to close the deal before his vacation. The regulators were threatening an immediate asset freeze, a move that would have halted payroll for 10,000 employees and shattered our stock price by Monday morning. For 2 days and 2 nights, I didn't sleep. I wasn't just fixing a spreadsheet. I was performing open-heart surgery on a bleeding company. The auditors were sharks smelling blood in the water, demanding collateral that David simply didn't have liquid. Desperate to keep the wolves at bay, I had done the unthinkable. I leveraged my personal portfolio, my home, and my private trust as a temporary bridge guarantee. I restructured the entire debt load under my own name, essentially telling the federal auditors, if this ship goes down, I drown with it. By the time David landed at JFK tanned and rested, the audit was closed, the assets were secure, and the stock was stable. He walked into the office, slapped me on the back, and told the board that his strategic oversight had smoothed out the bumps. I never corrected him. I let him believe the lie because I thought preserving his confidence was vital for the company's image. I didn't realize then that I wasn't protecting the company. I was merely feeding a monster that would eventually try to eat me. The taxi pulled up to my brownstone, a quiet, sturdy structure that Jessica often joked looked like a library. I paid the driver and went inside, the silence of the house wrapping around me like a protective cloak. I walked straight to the study, moving a framed painting of our late father to reveal the wall safe. My fingers traced the dial, the combination as familiar to me as my own birthday. Inside sat a single leather-bound folder, the Master Credit Agreement. This was the document David mocked, the boring paperwork he refused to read. I laid it on my mahogany desk and turned to page 42, section 8, subsection C. The ink was black and permanent, spelling out the reality that David was too arrogant to see. It was the key person covenant, a strict requirement demanded by Mrs. Sterling, our lead matriarchal investor who controlled 40% of our liquidity. Mrs. Sterling was a woman of few words and zero patience for incompetence. 3 years ago, after the Maldives incident, she had pulled me aside and whispered, "I am not betting on the jockey, Vanessa. The jockey is an idiot. I am betting on the horse." She had forced the bank to insert a clause stating that I, Vanessa Sterling, was the designated risk controller. The language was brutal in its simplicity. In the event that Vanessa Sterling ceases to hold the position of Chief Risk Officer or is removed from active oversight of the collateral accounts, all outstanding credit lines are subject to immediate recall. It meant that the moment I was fired, the bank didn't just have the right to ask for their money back, they were legally obligated to demand $50 million within 24 hours. David thought the bank loaned us money because of his charisma and his slideshows. The truth resting under the yellow light of my desk lamp was that the bank viewed David as a liability. They only gave him the checkbook because I was holding the leash. My signature wasn't just ink on a page, it was the structural steel holding up a skyscraper built on sand. I didn't feel a surge of glee. I felt a cold, clinical sense of closure. I reached for the generous severance package David had slid across the table and placed it next to the master credit agreement. Then I began to clean. For years, I had kept cheat sheets for David, simplified summaries of complex tax codes, reminders of compliance deadlines, and scripts for him to use when speaking to regulators so he wouldn't perjure himself. I gathered them all, stacks of papers that represented hours of my life spent making him look competent. I didn't pack them away for posterity. I fed them one by one into the industrial shredder by my desk. The machine whirred and gnashed a mechanical rhythm that sounded like a clock counting down. I wasn't sabotaging Sterling Industries. I wasn't planting a virus or stealing clients. I was simply removing the training wheels. If David wanted to ride the bike alone, he had to face the gravity that came with it. I watched the last of his executive summaries turn into confetti, feeling lighter than I had in decades. He wanted me to be a baker, fine. I would bake. But first he would have to learn how to survive in a kitchen that was about to catch fire. They spent years calling me just the sister, never realizing that to the bank, I was the only person who actually existed. The following morning, the sun was shining brightly over Manhattan, but inside the 45th floor conference room of Sterling Miller and Associates, the atmosphere was as cold and sterile as a surgical theater. David had summoned me for an 800 a.m. meeting, ensuring that I would be the first item he checked off his list before he began his new life as the sole monarch of our company. He sat across the glass table, drumming his fingers incessantly on the polished surface, checking his gold Rolex every 30 seconds, as if my very presence was stealing precious time from his visionary future. Beside him sat his attorney, a man named Marcus, who looked like he had been manufactured in a factory that produced sharks in Italian suits. Marcus slid a document toward me, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. A smile that suggested he believed he was about to bully a helpless aging spinster into submission. The document was titled, in bold, aggressive font, Total Severance and Release of Claims. It was thick, stapled in the corner, and smelled of fresh toner and finality. David leaned back in his leather chair, crossing his arms with an air of arrogant boredom. "It's standard boilerplate, Vanessa," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the glass-walled room. "We're just formalizing what we discussed at dinner. I want a clean break. No lingering voting rights, no honorary titles, and absolutely no hovering over my decisions. I want your name off everything: bank accounts, trust deeds, insurance policies. You walk away with your check, and I run the company. Simple." He pushed a black Mont Blanc pen toward me, the gesture clearly implying that reading the document was a waste of his valuable time. I picked up the document, ignoring the pen. I put on my reading glasses slowly, deliberately savoring the sound of David's impatient sigh. I began to read. The first few pages were exactly what I expected: a non-disparagement agreement, a forfeiture of unvested stock options, and a clause stripping me of my seat on the board. They were trying to erase me, to scour my fingerprints from the company I had built. But then on page 12, I found it. It was buried in a paragraph of dense legal jargon, a section titled Universal Indemnification and Assumption of Liability. My heart didn't race. Instead, it slowed down, beating with the heavy rhythmic thud of a judge's gavel. The clause stated that in exchange for my immediate resignation and the waiving of my rights, the remaining director, David, would hereby assume full and sole responsibility for all existing financial obligations, covenants, debts, and operational liabilities previously under the purview of the outgoing chief risk officer. I read it twice to be absolutely certain. David's lawyer had drafted this to protect David from me claiming any future profits, but in his haste to cut me out, he had crafted a legal suicide note. By signing this, David was not just taking my assets. He was legally agreeing to personally absorb the consequences of my departure. He was formally accepting liability for the breach of the key person covenant. He was putting in writing, notarized and binding, that when the bank called to demand their $50 million, because I was gone, he was the sole individual responsible for paying it. He thought he was claiming the crown. I knew he was claiming the guillotine. I looked up from the paper. David was tapping his foot now, a nervous tic he had developed in childhood whenever he wanted a toy I was playing with. Marcus, the lawyer, raised an eyebrow. "Is there a problem, Ms. Sterling? The terms are quite generous for someone in your position." I uncapped the heavy black pen. The metal felt cold against my fingers. This was it, the moment of no return. I looked at my brother, really looked at him, searching for a trace of the little boy I used to protect from neighborhood bullies. I wanted to give him one last off-ramp, one final opportunity to choose family over ego. "David," I said softly, my voice steady, "this clause subsection D, it transfers all liability to you. All of it. Are you absolutely sure you want to be solely responsible for everything from this moment on? Once I sign this, I can't help you. The wall comes down and you are on the other side alone." David groaned, rolling his eyes so hard he looked like a petulant teenager. "My God, Vanessa, are you still trying to mother me?" "Yes, that is the whole point. I want the liability. I want the responsibility. I want you out. Just sign the damn paper so I can get to my strategy meeting." The silence that followed lasted only a second, but it stretched into infinity. I saw him clearly then, not as a brother, but as a man consumed by his own reflection. I smiled. It wasn't a smile of warmth, and it wasn't a smile of submission. It was the chilling, serene smile of a surgeon who knows the limb must be amputated to save the body, even if the patient is screaming. "Very well," I whispered. I lowered the pen and signed my name with a flourish, the ink flowing smoothly onto the crisp white paper. Vanessa Sterling. The letters looped and curled, sealing his fate with an elegance he didn't deserve. I closed the folder and pushed it back toward the lawyer. Then I stood up. I picked up the severance check David had placed on the table, the money he thought bought my silence. I looked at it for a moment, then placed it gently back down on the glass surface right in front of him. "Keep it," I said. "You're going to need every penny." I turned and walked toward the glass doors, my heels clicking on the marble floor with a sound like gunfire. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I was walking out of that office not as an unemployed woman, but as a ghost leaving a haunted house. I was free. Behind me, I heard David let out a sigh of relief, the sound of a man who thinks he has won the lottery on the same day he has lost his ticket. He checked his watch, annoyed that I was taking too long. He didn't know I was taking a moment to say a silent prayer for him. The moment I stepped out of the law firm and onto the bustling sidewalk, I did something I hadn't done since 1998. I turned off my phone. For 20 years, that device had been a digital leash, vibrating with crises, panicked texts from David, and urgent emails from regulators at all hours of the night. Silencing it felt like unclipping a grenade from my belt. I took a cab straight home, changed into old denim overalls, and went out into my garden. For the next 48 hours, while I was on my knees digging into the cool, damp earth to plant hydrangeas, my former company was beginning to suffocate, gasping for the oxygen I had always provided. I didn't need to be in the office to know exactly what was happening. I had written the protocols after all. I knew that while I was pruning dead leaves, David was likely throwing a new era party in the boardroom, popping champagne corks that cost more than my first car. I could practically hear him ordering the contractors to tear down the walls of my office, eager to erase the stuffy atmosphere I had maintained. He was probably replacing my mahogany filing cabinets with glass and chrome, unaware that those cabinets contained the institutional memory that kept him out of jail. While David was busy toasting his own reflection, the first invisible cracks were already spiderwebbing across the foundation of Sterling Industries. At 4:00 p.m., on the first day, the bank's automated compliance server sent a routine status check ping to the chief risk officer's terminal. When it received no digital handshake in return because my credentials had been revoked by David's own IT order, it sent a darker, more urgent flag to the CEO's inbox. I knew David. I knew he had filtered all emails with the subject line compliance, audit, or urgent to a folder he rarely checked, preferring to let me handle the boring stuff. So the warning sat there unread, a digital time bomb ticking away in the darkness of a server room while he ordered another round of drinks. The second day brought the true catalyst the moment the dominoes began to fall with terrifying speed. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of day I would usually spend soothing the nerves of our skittish investors. I was in my kitchen making tea, enjoying the strange sensation of a silent afternoon, when the event I had anticipated finally occurred. I learned later from a loyal secretary exactly how it went down. Mrs. Sterling, the iron-willed matriarch whose capital was the lifeblood of our operation, called the main line. She didn't call to chat. She called because her internal team had noticed a discrepancy in the daily risk reports. When David answered the phone, he was high on adrenaline and arrogance. When she asked for me, David didn't just deflect, he gloated. "Vanessa is no longer with us, Mrs. Sterling," he told her, his voice booming for his sycophantic audience. "We've trimmed the fat. I am handling the big picture now. We're moving faster, leaner, and bolder." There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. Mrs. Sterling was a woman who valued stability over speed and prudence over boldness. She didn't argue. She didn't scream. She simply said, "I see. Thank you for the information, David," and hung up. David turned to his team, likely grinning, thinking he had finally exerted his dominance over the old guard. He had no idea that he hadn't impressed her. He had terrified her. The moment the line went dead, Mrs. Sterling didn't go to lunch. She called her legal team and uttered 3 words that destroy empires: trigger the clause. She initiated the immediate recall. She wanted her money, and she wanted it before the ship she believed was now captainless hit the iceberg. By the morning of the third day, the rot had reached the surface. The 72-hour grace period for the debt covenants had expired. I was sitting on my patio watching a cardinal land on my fence, feeling a profound sense of peace. David, meanwhile, was walking into a power lunch at Le Bernardin with 3 potential clients he was desperate to woo. He was selling them on the new Sterling, a company of limitless potential. The lunch went well, fueled by expensive wine and David's charismatic lies. When the bill came, a check for nearly $4,000, David waved it away with a flourish and slapped down the corporate black card, the symbol of his unlimited power. The waiter took the card and walked away. A few minutes later, he returned, leaning in close, his voice a discreet whisper. "I'm sorry, sir. The card was declined." David laughed, a loud, incredulous sound. "Don't be ridiculous. Run it again. It's a chip error." The waiter retreated and returned moments later, looking more uncomfortable. "It was declined again, sir. The machine says, 'Contact administrator.' Do you have another form of payment?" The clients were watching now, the smiles fading from their faces. David, face flushing a deep crimson, pulled out his personal card. Declined. He pulled out the backup reserve card. Declined. Panic, cold and sharp, finally pierced his bubble of delusion. He grabbed his phone and dialed the private concierge line for our business bank, screaming into the receiver right there in the middle of the restaurant. "This is David Sterling. Why are my cards not working? I have $100 million in assets with you people." The restaurant went silent. The clients exchanged awkward glances, checking their watches. The voice on the other end of the phone was not the polite concierge he was used to. It was a risk management officer, cold and detached. "Mr. Sterling, as of 8 a.m. this morning, all credit facilities have been frozen pending a full audit. The primary guarantor, Ms. Vanessa Sterling, has been removed from the account, violating the liquidity covenant." David's face went pale, the blood draining away as the reality hit him like a physical blow. He screamed at the waiter, "Do you know who I am?" The problem was the bank knew exactly who he was, and that was the issue. The silence I had cultivated in my garden did not last long. By late afternoon, the chaos that had erupted in the restaurant had spilled over into my sanctuary. It started with the aggressive ringing of my doorbell, a sound that shattered the peace of my living room where I was quietly reading a book. I knew who it was before I even opened the door. My mother stood on the porch, her usually immaculate hair windblown and her face streaked with mascara tears. She didn't say hello. She simply pushed past me into the hallway, bringing a gust of frantic energy with her. She was the family's emotional enforcer, the one who had spent 40 years smoothing over David's rough edges and convincing me that my role was to be the shock absorber for his reckless driving. She collapsed onto my sofa, clutching her handkerchief, and launched into the monologue I had memorized since childhood. "How could you let this happen, Vanessa?" she sobbed, looking at me as if I were the villain in a tragedy she couldn't understand. "He is your brother. He is flesh and blood. The accounts are frozen, the payroll is due tomorrow, and there are men in suits at the office serving papers. You have to stop this. You have to go down there and fix it." I walked to the kitchen and began to prepare a pot of tea, my movements slow and deliberate. I refused to let her panic become my emergency. "I haven't done anything, Mother," I said calmly, setting a porcelain cup in front of her. "I am simply retired." She looked up at me, her eyes flashing with that familiar mix of desperation and accusation. "Don't be petty, Vanessa. This is the family legacy. You are destroying your father's name because of a bruised ego. Be the bigger person. You always are. Just make the call, apologize to the bank, and put this right." It was the trap I had walked into 1,000 times before the weaponization of family duty to excuse David's incompetence. But before I could answer, the front door was thrown open again. David stormed in, and he looked like a man who had been physically beaten. His tie was loosened, his expensive suit was rumpled, and there was a wild, hunted look in his eyes that I had never seen before. He didn't have the swagger of the dinner party anymore. He marched right up to me, invading my personal space, shaking a crumpled piece of paper in my face. "You did this!" he screamed, spit flying from his lips. "You sabotaged me! You rigged the system so it would blow up the second you left." I took the paper from his trembling hand. It was a formal notice from the bank, notice of immediate recall. They were demanding repayment of the entire $50 million credit facility within 24 hours due to a breach of the liquidity covenant. "I didn't rig anything, David," I said, my voice level. "I warned you at the dinner. I asked you if you had read the surety clause. You laughed at me." David ran a hand through his hair, pacing the room like a caged animal. "I don't care about the past. Fix it. Call Mrs. Sterling. Call the bank. Tell them you're back on the board. Tell them it was a clerical error. If we don't have that credit line by morning, checks will bounce. I will be investigated for insolvency. Do you hear me? I could go to jail." He expected me to cave. He expected me to sigh, pick up the phone and spend the next week cleaning up his mess while he took the credit for managing the crisis. It was the dance we had done for 20 years, but the music had stopped. I walked over to the side table where I had placed the copy of the document I had signed just yesterday, the total severance and release of claims. I picked it up and held it out to him. "I can't help you, David," I said softly. "And I don't mean I won't. I mean I legally cannot." He stopped pacing and stared at me. "What are you talking about?" "Read Section 4, Paragraph 2, I said, pointing to the text he had been too arrogant to read in the lawyer's office. "The non-interference clause. You had your lawyer draft this to keep me from meddling. It states that I am strictly prohibited from contacting investors, creditors, or employees regarding company operations. It says that any attempt by me to influence company strategy or financial standing will be met with a lawsuit for breach of contract." I looked him dead in the eye. "You threatened to sue me if I hovered, David. You bought my silence. You bought my absence. If I call the bank now, I am interfering with your company. I am simply obeying the contract you forced me to sign. David's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked from the document to me, the realization crashing down on him. He had built a wall to keep me out, and now that the room was filling with water, he realized he had locked the door from the inside. He had stripped me of the right to save him. But surely you can waive it, he stammered, his voice breaking. We can tear it up. I have already filed my copy with the SEC. I lied smoothly, though the effect was the same. It's a matter of public record now. You are the sole liable director. You wanted the crown, David. It's heavy, isn't it? My mother stood up trembling, realizing that her tears weren't working this time. Vanessa, please, she whispered. He's your brother. You're breaking this family apart. I looked at my mother and said, I didn't break the family. I just stopped being the glue that held the broken pieces together. The fallout from that afternoon was swift, brutal, and entirely predictable to anyone who understood the mathematics of debt. The bank did not care about David's charm, his vision boards, or his desperate pleas for an extension. When the 24-hour deadline expired at 8:00 a.m. the next morning, the default was triggered instantly. Sterling Industries. The behemoth I had spent a lifetime building was technically insolvent. David faced a terrifying choice. He could let the company collapse into bankruptcy, which would trigger a forensic investigation that would likely land him in federal prison for trading while insolvent, or he could accept a humiliating lifeline. He chose the latter, though it must have tasted like ash in his mouth. Mrs. Sterling, the very woman he had dismissed on the phone just days earlier, stepped in not as a savior, but as an acquirer. Her investment firm purchased the distressed debt for pennies on the dollar, effectively converting the loan into equity. In a matter of hours, she went from being a minority investor to the majority owner of the entire corporation. David was not fired. That would have been too kind. Instead, he was stripped of his executive powers, his budget, and his dignity. To avoid a public scandal that would devalue the stock, Mrs. Sterling allowed him to retain a seat on the board and a small, non-voting percentage of equity, but he was removed as CEO immediately. He was given a ceremonial title, Founder Emeritus, which sounded grand, but meant absolutely nothing. He was moved from the corner office with the panoramic view of Central Park to a small, windowless office near the archives on the third floor. He was reduced to a figurehead, a mascot for a team he was no longer allowed to coach. He had tried to make me irrelevant by pushing me into the shadows. In a twist of poetic justice, he was now the one who existed solely on paper, invisible to the operations of the company he claimed to build. 3 weeks later, the board of directors convened for an emergency restructuring meeting. The atmosphere in the boardroom was unrecognizable from the champagne-soaked arrogance of the anniversary dinner. The air was serious, heavy with the scent of coffee and anxiety. Mrs. Sterling sat at the head of the table, David's old seat. She looked every bit the Iron Lady of Finance, her gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, her eyes scanning the room with terrifying intelligence. David was there too, but he was sitting in a folding chair in the back corner, away from the mahogany table, clutching a notepad like a chastised intern. He looked older, smaller, his bravado stripped away to reveal the frightened child underneath. When Mrs. Sterling cleared her throat, the room went deadly silent. Gentlemen, she said, her voice crisp, we have spent the last month chasing fantasies. It is time to return to reality. We need a chief executive officer who understands that assets must be protected before they can be leveraged. We need someone who reads the fine print. She nodded to the double doors at the far end of the room. They opened and I walked in. I wasn't wearing a revenge dress or a flashy designer suit meant to signal my new wealth. I was wearing a simple, well-tailored navy blazer and trousers comfortable, authoritative, and authentically me. I didn't stride in with a smirk. I didn't look at the board members who had laughed at my vintage dress weeks ago, though I saw them shift uncomfortably in their seats, suddenly finding their shoes very interesting. I walked straight to the empty chair at the head of the table, the one Mrs. Sterling vacated for me as she moved to the side. The silence was absolute. It wasn't the dismissive silence of the dinner party. It was the heavy, reverent silence of respect. I placed my leather portfolio on the table, the same battered portfolio I had carried for 20 years. I opened it, smoothing out the spreadsheet inside. For a moment, I let the silence hang, letting them feel the shift in gravity. Then I looked up. I didn't look at David. I didn't acknowledge his presence in the corner. To look at him would be to give him power, and he had none left to give. I looked at the board members, the men who had toasted my exit. "Good morning," I said, my voice calm and steady, echoing off the glass walls. "We have a lot of work to do. The era of aggressive expansion is over. We are returning to the principles of solvency, compliance, and sustainable growth. We are going to build a company that stands on bedrock, not on ego." I began the meeting diving straight into the numbers, outlining the recovery plan I had drafted in my garden while planting hydrangeas. As I spoke, I saw the relief on the faces around the table. They didn't want a rock star. They wanted a captain who knew how to steer the ship through a storm. They nodded, taking notes, hanging on my every word, not because I was shouting, but because I was right. I had reclaimed my company not by fighting David's war, but by letting him lose it. True leadership, I realized as I turned the page of my report, isn't about being the loudest voice in the room. It is about being the one who understands the foundation so well that the building cannot stand without you. I had earned the one thing David had denied me for my entire life, the one thing that money and titles couldn't buy. I had earned their respect. As the meeting adjourned and the directors lined up to shake my hand, I finally glanced over at the corner. David was watching me, his pen hovering over a blank page, his face a mask of resignation. David wanted a kingdom where he didn't have to listen to me. Now he lives in a world where he has no choice. What a satisfying conclusion to a lifetime of silence. Vanessa proved that sometimes the loudest move you can make is to simply stop holding everything together and let the pieces fall where they may. But now I want to turn this conversation over to you, because I know many of you have carried heavy burdens for your families that went unnoticed for far too long. Do you think Vanessa was right to wait until David forced her hand? Or should she have walked away years ago to teach him a lesson sooner? And I am particularly curious about your thoughts on the mother's plea. Is there ever a point where family duty becomes a toxic trap that we have to break to save ourselves? Or do we owe our siblings our support no matter how ungrateful they are? I read every single comment, and I am genuinely curious to hear your wisdom and personal experiences on this difficult topic. If you believe that respect should be earned and not just demanded, please take a moment to click that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We are building a community here that values substance over noise, just like Vanessa did, and I would love for you to be a part of our next story. Let me know your thoughts down below, and I will see you in the next video.